Rhetoric. Aristotle. Book 1. Chapter 1. Rhetoric is the counterpart to dialectic. Both deal with subjects that are, in a way, within everyone's grasp and don't belong to any specialized field of knowledge. That's why everyone engages in both to some extent. Everyone attempts to examine and defend arguments, to defend themselves and to accuse others. Most people do these things either randomly or through practice that has become habitual. Since both approaches are possible, it's clear we can make this a systematic method. We can study why some people succeed through practice and others by chance, and everyone would agree that such study is the work of a systematic discipline. Now, those who have written handbooks on speaking have barely touched on what truly matters in the discipline. Logical proofs are the only technical element, everything else is just window dressing. These writers say nothing about enthymemes, which are the substance of persuasion, but instead focus mostly on matters external to the case itself. Emotional manipulation, pity, anger, and similar psychological states aren't about the facts, they're aimed at the judge. If all trials were conducted as they are in some well-governed cities today, especially those with good laws, these handbook writers would have nothing to say. Everyone agrees that laws should prohibit irrelevant arguments, and some cities actually enforce this, just as the Areopagus court does, and rightly so. We shouldn't twist the judge's judgment by provoking anger, envy, or pity. That would be like warping the measuring stick you're about to use. Furthermore, it's obvious that the only job of someone presenting a case is to show that something is or isn't true, that it did or didn't happen. Whether it's important or trivial, just or unjust, whatever the lawmaker hasn't defined, the judge must determine for himself, not learn from the opposing parties. The best laws should define everything possible themselves, leaving as little as possible to the judges. First, it's easier to find one person or a few people with good judgment who can make laws and judge cases than to find many. Second, laws are made after long deliberation, while judgments are made on the spot, making it hard for judges to properly determine what's just and beneficial. Most importantly, the lawmaker's decision isn't about specific cases but about future situations and general principles, while assembly members and jurors decide about immediate, specific cases. Their personal feelings, affection, hatred, and self-interest often get involved, preventing them from seeing the truth clearly because their own pleasure or pain clouds their judgment. As I said, we should give judges as little discretionary power as possible in other matters. But we must leave it to them to determine whether something happened or not, will happen or won't, exists or doesn't. The lawmaker can't foresee these things. If this is true, then those who define irrelevant matters, like what the introduction or narrative should contain, and so on, are dealing with externals. They focus entirely on manipulating the judge's emotions while teaching nothing about technical proofs, which are what make someone skilled in logical argument. This is why, even though the same method applies to both political and legal speaking, and even though political speaking is nobler and more civic-minded than courtroom arguments about contracts, these writers say nothing about political rhetoric but all try to write about courtroom techniques. The reason is that it's less profitable to bring up irrelevant matters in political speeches, and political debate is less underhanded than courtroom advocacy because it concerns the community as a whole. In political debates, judges decide about their own interests, so speakers only need to prove their proposals are as they claim. But in legal cases, this isn't enough. It's profitable to win over the listener, since the judgment concerns other people's affairs. Judges looking out for their own interests and listening to gain favor give in to the litigants rather than truly judging. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, many places legally prohibit irrelevant arguments, while in political assemblies, the judges themselves adequately guard against this. Since it's clear that the technical method concerns proofs, and proof is a kind of demonstration, we're most convinced when we think something has been demonstrated, and rhetorical demonstration is the enthymeme, which is, generally speaking, the most powerful form of proof, and the enthymeme is a kind of syllogism, and examining all types of syllogisms belongs to dialectic, either as a whole or in part. It follows that whoever can best understand how syllogisms work and what they're made of will be most skilled at enthymemes. This requires understanding what enthymemes deal with and how they differ from logical syllogisms. The ability to see both truth and what resembles truth belongs to the same faculty. Moreover, people have a natural inclination toward truth and usually get it right. Therefore, being good at hitting upon commonly accepted opinions requires the same ability as finding the truth. So it's clear that other handbook writers focus on irrelevant matters and lean too heavily toward courtroom pleading. But rhetoric is useful because truth and justice are naturally stronger than their opposites. When decisions don't go as they should, truth and justice are necessarily defeated by their own advocates, and that deserves criticism. Additionally, with some audiences, even if we had the most exact knowledge, it wouldn't be easy to persuade them by using it. Scientific teaching is impossible with some groups. We must construct our proofs and arguments from common knowledge, as I said in the topics about addressing ordinary people. We must also be able to argue both sides of a question, just as in dialectical reasoning, not so we can actually do both. We shouldn't persuade people of what's wrong, but so we can see clearly how things stand and can refute someone who argues unfairly. No other discipline argues opposite conclusions, only dialectic and rhetoric do this, since both deal equally with opposites. However, the underlying facts aren't equally balanced. What's true and better is always naturally easier to prove and more persuasive. Besides, it's absurd if it's shameful not to be able to defend yourself physically but not shameful to be unable to defend yourself with words, since using speech is more characteristic of humans than using physical force. If someone objects that a person could do great harm by unjustly using the power of words, this applies to all good things except virtue, especially the most useful things like strength, health, wealth, and military leadership. Used justly, these can provide the greatest benefits; used unjustly, they can cause the greatest harm. Clearly, then, rhetoric isn't limited to any single, defined type of subject, but is like dialectic. It's useful, and its function isn't to persuade but to discover the available means of persuasion in each case, just as in all other disciplines. Medicine's job isn't to make someone healthy but to promote health as much as possible. Even those who can't recover can still be treated well. Additionally, the same discipline studies both what's persuasive and what appears persuasive, just as dialectic studies both real and apparent syllogisms. What makes someone a sophist isn't their ability but their moral choice. However, in rhetoric, we call someone a rhetorician either based on their knowledge of the discipline or their moral purpose, while in dialectic, a sophist is defined by moral purpose, and a dialectician by ability, not moral purpose. Let's now try to discuss the method itself, how and from what sources we can achieve our objectives. Starting again, as if from the beginning, let's define what rhetoric is and then discuss the rest. Chapter 2. Let rhetoric be defined as the ability to observe the available means of persuasion in each particular case. This is the function of no other discipline. Each of the others teaches and persuades about its own subject matter: medicine about health and disease, geometry about the properties of magnitudes, arithmetic about numbers, and similarly for the other disciplines and sciences. But rhetoric seems able to observe what's persuasive about any given subject. That's why we say its technical application isn't limited to any specific, defined class of subjects. Some forms of persuasion are non-technical, others technical. By non-technical, I mean those not provided by us but already existing, things like witnesses, testimony from torture, contracts, and so on. Technical means are those that can be prepared methodically by us. We must use the former and discover the latter. Of the proofs provided through speech, there are three kinds: those that depend on the speaker's character, those that put the audience in a certain emotional state, and those in the speech itself that prove or appear to prove the point. Persuasion occurs through character when the speech is delivered in a way that makes the speaker seem trustworthy. We more readily believe good people, and believe them more quickly, about everything in general and completely in matters where precision is lacking and opinions differ. This too should result from the speech, not from any preconceived opinion about the speaker's character. It's wrong to say, as some handbook writers do, that the speaker's goodness contributes nothing to persuasiveness. Character is almost the most authoritative form of proof. Persuasion occurs through the audience when they're led by the speech into an emotional state. We don't make judgments the same way when we're sad as when we're happy, when we're friendly as when we're hostile. This is what current handbook writers try to focus on exclusively. I'll clarify these matters when I discuss the emotions. Persuasion occurs through the speech itself when we demonstrate truth or apparent truth from whatever is persuasive in each case. Since proofs come through these means, clearly all three are available to someone who can reason logically, understand character and virtues, and understand emotions, what each emotion is, what it's like, what causes emotions, and how they arise. So rhetoric turns out to be an offshoot of dialectic and of the study of character, which we properly call politics. That's why rhetoric disguises itself as politics, as do those who claim expertise in it, some through lack of education, some through boastfulness, some for other human reasons. Rhetoric is a part of dialectic and resembles it, as we said at the beginning. Neither is a science of any definite subject matter but their abilities to provide arguments. Regarding their capacity and their relationship to each other, perhaps enough has been said. As for proof by demonstration or apparent demonstration, just as in dialectic we have induction, syllogism, and apparent syllogism, the same applies here. Example is induction, enthymeme is syllogism, and apparent enthymeme is apparent syllogism. I call enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism and example rhetorical induction. Everyone produces proofs by stating either examples or enthymemes. There's nothing else. Since anyone who demonstrates anything must use either syllogism or induction, this is clear from the analytics. Each of these must be the same as each of those. The difference between example and enthymeme is clear from the topics, where syllogism and induction were discussed earlier. Showing that something is so based on many similar cases is induction in dialectic, example in rhetoric. When certain propositions being true means something else follows from them, either universally or usually, because they are true, this is called syllogism in dialectic and enthymeme in rhetoric. Each type of rhetoric clearly has advantages. As stated in the methods, some rhetorical styles use examples, others enthymemes, and similarly, some speakers prefer examples, others enthymemes. Speeches using examples are no less persuasive, but those with enthymemes are more stirring. We'll explain the reason for this and how to use each later. Now let's define these more clearly. What's persuasive is persuasive to someone, and something is persuasive and credible either immediately through itself or because it seems to be proven by things that are persuasive and credible. No discipline examines the individual case. Medicine doesn't consider what's healthy for Socrates or Callias but what's healthy for this type of person or these types of people. This is what's technical. The individual case is infinite and unknowable. Similarly, rhetoric won't consider what seems probable to Socrates or Hippias individually, but what seems probable to people of certain types, just like dialectic. Dialectic doesn't construct syllogisms from random propositions. Some things seem true even to madmen, but from propositions that need reasoning, and rhetoric from subjects people actually deliberate about. Rhetoric's function concerns things we deliberate about without having specialized disciplines for them, and it addresses audiences who can't follow extended chains of reasoning or calculate from a distance. We deliberate about things that seem capable of being one way or another. No one deliberates about things that can't be otherwise or happen differently. There's no point. It's possible to draw conclusions and make arguments either from previous conclusions or from premises that haven't been reasoned through but need to be because they're not commonly accepted. The first approach is necessarily hard to follow because of its length. The judge is assumed to be a simple person. The second unpersuasive because it doesn't proceed from agreed upon or probable premises. Therefore, the enthymeme and example must concern things that can usually be otherwise. The example is induction, the enthymeme is syllogism, proceeding from few premises and often fewer than the primary syllogism. If one of these is well known, it needn't be stated, the listener adds it himself. For instance, to say that Doriaeus won a crown contest, it's enough to say he won the Olympic Games. There's no need to add that the Olympic Games involve a crown, everyone knows that. Since few of the premises from which rhetorical syllogisms proceed are necessary, most things we make judgments and inquiries about can be otherwise. We deliberate and inquire about actions. And all actions are of this contingent type, and none, so to speak, are necessary, and since things that usually happen or are possible must be reasoned from similar premises, while necessary conclusions come from necessary premises. This too is clear from the analytics. It's evident that the premises of enthymemes will sometimes be necessary but mostly only usually true. Enthymemes are derived from probabilities and signs, so each of these must correspond to each type of premise. A probability is what happens usually, not simply, as some define it, but concerning things that can be otherwise. It relates to that which it's probable about as the universal to the particular. Of signs, one type is like the relationship of the particular to the universal, another like the universal to the particular. The necessary sign is evidence, the non-necessary has no special name for its difference. By necessary, I mean premises from which a syllogism can be formed. That's why this type of sign is evidence. When people think what's been said can't be refuted, they think they're offering evidence, as if the matter were demonstrated and concluded. In ancient Greek, tekmar and paris mean the same thing. One type of sign, the particular to universal relationship, would be if someone said it's a sign that wise men are just because Socrates was wise and just. This is indeed a sign, but it's refutable even if the statement is true, it doesn't form a syllogism. But if someone said it's a sign someone is sick because they have a fever, or that a woman has given birth because she has milk, that's necessary. This alone among signs is evidence. If it's true, it's irrefutable. The type that goes from universal to particular would be if someone said rapid breathing is a sign of fever. This too is refutable even if true, someone might pant without having a fever. What probability, sign, and evidence are, and how they differ, has been stated now, but these matters and the reason why some don't form syllogisms while others do has been more clearly defined in the analytics. That example is induction, and what kind of induction it is has been stated. It's neither like part to whole, nor whole to part, nor whole to whole, but part to part, like to like. When both fall under the same genus but one is better known than the other, it's an example. For instance, Dionysus is plotting tyranny because he asks for a bodyguard. Pisistratus also asked for a guard when plotting before, and became tyrant when he got it, as did Theogenes in Megara. All the other known cases become examples regarding Dionysus, whom we don't yet know if he's asking for this reason. All these fall under the same universal principle. That someone plotting tyranny asks for a bodyguard. The sources of demonstrative proofs have been stated. But there's a huge difference in enthymemes that has escaped almost everyone's notice, the same difference found in the dialectical method of syllogisms. Some enthymemes belong to rhetoric just as some syllogisms belong to dialectic, but others belong to other disciplines and faculties, some already existing, others not yet discovered. That's why speakers miss this point, and the more they try to elaborate on something properly, the more they shift away from rhetoric and dialectic. This will be clearer if explained at greater length. I mean that dialectical and rhetorical syllogisms are those about which we state the topics. These are common topics about justice, physics, politics, and many different subjects, like the topic of more and less. It will be no more possible to make a syllogism or state an enthymeme from this about justice than about physics or anything else, though these differ in kind. But specific topics are those derived from premises about each particular kind and type. For instance, there are premises about physics from which no enthymeme or syllogism about ethics can be derived, and premises about ethics from which nothing about physics can be derived. The same applies to all subjects. Those common topics won't make anyone knowledgeable about any particular subject because they're not about any underlying subject matter. But with these specific topics, the better one selects the premises, the more unknowingly one creates a different science from dialectic and rhetoric. If one happens upon first principles, it's no longer dialectic or rhetoric but the discipline whose principles one has grasped. Most enthymemes are stated from these particular, specific types, fewer from common topics. Just as in the topics, here too we must distinguish the species and topics of enthymemes. By species I mean the specific premises of each class, by topics those common to all alike. But first, let's discuss the types of rhetoric, so that after distinguishing how many there are, we can separately grasp their elements and premises. Chapter 3. The types of rhetoric are 3 in number, for that's how many types of listeners to speeches there are. A speech consists of 3 things: the speaker, the subject, and the person addressed. The objective relates to this last one, the listener. The listener must be either a spectator or a judge, and a judge either of past or future events. The one judging future events is the assembly member, the one judging past events is the juror, and the one judging the speaker's ability is the spectator. Therefore, there are necessarily 3 types of rhetorical speeches: deliberative, judicial, and ceremonial. Deliberative speaking involves either urging or warning. Those who give private advice and those who speak publicly in assemblies always do one or the other. Legal speaking involves either accusation or defense. Litigants necessarily do one or the other. Ceremonial speaking involves either praise or blame. Each type has its own time frame. For the deliberative speaker, the future, advising about what will happen, either urging or warning; for the legal speaker, the past, always prosecuting or defending about what has been done; for the ceremonial speaker, the present is most important. Everyone praises or blames based on current circumstances, though they often also recall the past and anticipate the future. Each type has a different objective. 3 types, 3 objectives. For the deliberative speaker, it's the advantageous and harmful. One who urges presents something as better. One who warns against presents it as worse, taking up other considerations like justice or honor as secondary. For legal speakers, it's the just and unjust, with other considerations secondary to these. For those who praise and blame, it's the noble and shameful, referring other considerations to these. Here's proof that each type's objective is as stated. Speakers sometimes won't dispute other points. For instance, a defendant might not deny something happened or that it caused harm, but would never admit to acting unjustly. That would eliminate the need for a trial. Similarly, deliberative speakers often concede other points but would never admit they're advising disadvantageous things or discouraging beneficial ones. They often think nothing of whether it's unjust to enslave neighboring peoples who've done no wrong. Likewise, those who praise or blame don't consider whether someone's actions were advantageous or harmful but often include in their praise that someone disregarded their own benefit to do something noble. For instance, they praise Achilles for helping his companion Patroclus knowing he must die, when he could have lived. For him, such a death was nobler, though living was advantageous. From what's been said, it's clear that we must first have premises about these matters. Evidence, probabilities, and signs are rhetorical premises. Syllogisms are wholly composed of premises, and the enthymeme is a syllogism composed of the stated premises. Since impossibilities can't be done or have been done, only possibilities can, and since what hasn't happened or won't happen couldn't have been done or be done in the future, the deliberative, judicial, and ceremonial speaker must have premises about the possible and impossible, and about whether something has happened or not, and whether it will happen or not. Furthermore, since all speakers, whether praising or blaming, urging or discouraging, accusing or defending, try to show not just the points mentioned but also that the good or evil, noble or shameful, just or unjust is great or small, either speaking of things in themselves or comparing them to each other, it's clear we need premises about magnitude and smallness and the greater and lesser, both generally and specifically. For instance, what is a greater or lesser good, wrongdoing, or just act, and similarly for other things. We've now stated what premises are necessarily needed. Next, we must distinguish specifically about each type, what deliberation concerns, what ceremonial speeches address, and third, what legal cases involve. Chapter 4. First, we must grasp what kinds of good and bad things the deliberative speaker advises about, since not about everything, but only things that can either happen or not. Not about things that necessarily are or will be, or that are impossible to be or happen. There's no deliberation about these. Nor indeed about all possible things. Some goods happen naturally or by chance among possibilities, and there's no point advising about these. Clearly, we deliberate about things that can be deliberated. These are things that naturally relate to us and whose origin of coming to be is in our control. We examine things up to the point where we discover whether they're possible or impossible for us to do. To enumerate precisely and classify what people usually deal with, and further to define these according to truth, isn't necessary for the present occasion. That belongs not to rhetoric but to a more intelligent and truthful discipline. Much more than its proper theoretical content has already been given to rhetoric. What we've said before is true. Rhetoric is composed of analytical science and the political science of character, and resembles partly dialectic, partly sophistic arguments. The more one tries to construct dialectic or rhetoric not as abilities but as sciences, the more one will unconsciously obscure their nature by the change, reconstructing them as sciences of certain underlying subjects rather than just of arguments. Nevertheless, let's now state what it's useful to analyze while still leaving examination to political science. Pretty much all people deliberate about, and deliberative speakers address, 5 main subjects: finances, war and peace, national defense, imports and exports, and legislation. Someone who will advise about finances needs to know the city's revenues, what and how much they are, so any overlooked source can be added and any insufficient one increased. Also, all the city's expenditures, so any unnecessary one can be eliminated and any excessive one reduced. People become wealthier not just by adding to what they have but also by cutting expenses. One can't see these things only from personal experience. One must also study what others have discovered for advising about these matters. About war and peace. Knowing the city's power, how much it has and how much it could have, what kind it is and what could be added, and also what wars it has fought and how. One needs to know these things not just about one's own city but also about neighboring ones, and which one's war is likely with, to maintain peace with stronger ones and have the choice of war with weaker ones. And whether their forces are similar or different, it's possible to have an advantage or disadvantage here. One must have studied not just one's own wars but also others' wars and how they turn out. Similar causes naturally produce similar results. About national defense. Not missing how the country is guarded, knowing the size and type of the guard force and the locations of guard posts. Impossible without familiarity with the territory, so that inadequate guards can be reinforced, superfluous ones removed, and suitable places better guarded. About food supply. How much expenditure is sufficient for the city, what kind is produced locally and what imported, what exports and imports are needed, to make agreements and contracts with the right people. Citizens must be kept blameless in relation to 2 groups. those who are stronger and those useful for trade. For security, one must be able to consider all these things, but understanding legislation is most important. The city's preservation lies in its laws. So one must know how many types of constitutions there are, what benefits each, and what naturally tends to destroy them, both internal and opposing factors. By destruction from internal factors, I mean that except for the best constitution, all the others are destroyed by being either relaxed or strained too much. For instance, democracy becomes weaker not just by being relaxed, eventually reaching oligarchy, but also by being greatly intensified. It's like how a hooked or snub nose not only reaches the mean by being relaxed, but when it becomes extremely hooked or snub, it's arranged so it doesn't even seem to be a nose anymore. For legislation, it's useful not just to understand what constitution is beneficial by studying the past, but also to know the constitutions of other cities, which types fit which peoples. So clearly, for legislation, travel accounts are useful. From these one can learn the laws of different peoples, and for political deliberations, the histories of those who write about actions are useful. But all this belongs to politics, not rhetoric. These are the most important things someone who will give advice must have. Let's now state again the sources from which one should urge or discourage about these and other matters. Chapter 5. People have, both individually and collectively, a target they aim at in their choices and avoidances. To state it summarily, this is happiness and its parts. So let's take as an example what happiness is, simply stated, and what its parts consist of. All urging and discouraging concerns happiness, what contributes to it, and their opposites. We should do things that provide happiness or one of its parts, or that make it greater rather than smaller, and not do things that destroy, hinder, or produce its opposite. Let happiness be defined as doing well with virtue, or self-sufficiency of life, or the most pleasant life with security, or prosperity of possessions and bodies with the ability to preserve and use them. Pretty much everyone agrees happiness is one or more of these things. If happiness is something like this, its parts must be good birth, many friends, wealth, good children, many children, a good old age, also bodily excellences, like health, beauty, strength, size, athletic ability, reputation, honor, good luck, and virtue. Someone would be most self-sufficient if they had both internal and external goods. There are no others besides these. Internal goods are those of soul and body. External are good birth, friends, money, and honor. We think it fitting to also have power and luck. That makes life most secure. Let's similarly grasp what each of these is. Good birth for a people or city means being indigenous or ancient, that the first leaders were renowned, and that many famous people have come from them in admired areas. For an individual, good birth derives from either the male or female line, legitimacy from both, and just as for a city, that the founders were known for virtue, wealth, or something else that's honored, and that many distinguished people have come from the family, men, women, young and old. Good children and many children are clear. For the community, it means having many good young people, good in bodily excellence like size, beauty, strength, athletic ability, and in soul with temperance and courage, which are a young person's virtues. For an individual, good and many children means having many of one's own children of this quality, both female and male. For females, bodily excellence is beauty and size, excellence of soul is temperance and industriousness without servility. We must seek to have each of these qualities both privately and publicly, among both men and women. Where the situation of women is poor, as among the Spartans, they're hardly half happy. The parts of wealth are abundance of money and land, possession of plots outstanding in number, size, and beauty, also possession of furniture, slaves, and livestock outstanding in number and beauty. All these should be one's own, secure, befitting a free person, and useful. Useful things are more productive, things befitting a free person are for enjoyment. By productive I mean things from which income comes, by enjoyable those from which nothing comes beyond their use that's worth mentioning. The definition of security is possessing things in such a place and manner that their use is up to oneself. Things are one's own or not when it's up to oneself to alienate them. By alienation I mean giving and selling. In general, being wealthy consists more in using than in possessing, for the activity and use of such things is wealth. Good reputation is being considered serious by everyone, or having something of the sort that everyone, most people, good people, or prudent people desire. Honor is a sign of a reputation for doing good. Those who have done good are justly and especially honored, though someone capable of doing good is also honored. Doing good relates to preservation and whatever causes existence, or to wealth, or to any other goods that aren't easily acquired either generally, or here, or at a particular time. Many people gain honor through things that seem small, but it depends on places and occasions. Parts of honor include sacrifices, memorials in verse and prose, privileges, sanctuaries, front seats, public tombs, statues, public maintenance, barbarian customs like prostrations and giving way, and gifts that are valued by each group. A gift is both giving property and a sign of honor, which is why both money lovers and honor lovers desire them. It has what both need. It's property, which money lovers want, and it confers honor, which honor lovers want. Bodily excellence is health, being free from disease while using one's body. Many people are healthy, as Herodotus supposedly was, whom no one would call fortunate in health because they abstain from all or most human activities. Beauty differs according to each stage of life. For a young person, beauty is having a body useful for endurance contests of running and strength, while being pleasant to look at for enjoyment. That's why pentathletes are most beautiful, being naturally suited for both strength and speed. For someone in their prime, it's being suited for the toils of war and seeming pleasant yet formidable. For an old person, it's being adequate for necessary toils and painless through lacking what mars old age. Strength is the power to move another as one wishes. One must move another by pulling, pushing, lifting, pressing, or squeezing, so the strong person is strong in all or some of these. Excellence of size is being superior to most people in height, depth, and breadth to such a degree that it doesn't make movements slower through the excess. Athletic bodily excellence is composed of size, strength, and speed. The fast person is also strong. Someone who can throw their legs in a certain way and move them quickly and far as a runner. Who can squeeze and hold down, a wrestler. Who can thrust away with a blow, a boxer. Who can do both of the latter, a pancratist. Who can do all, a pentathlete. A good old age is aging slowly without pain. It's not a good old age if someone ages quickly or slowly but painfully. This comes from bodily excellences and luck. Someone who isn't healthy and strong won't be free from suffering or painless, nor could they last long without luck. There's another capacity for longevity apart from strength and health. Many are long-lived without bodily excellences. But precise discussion of these matters isn't useful for present purposes. Many friends and good friends are clear once a friend is defined. A friend is someone who does what they think is good for another person for that person's sake. Someone with many such people has many friends. If they're also decent people, they have good friends. Good luck is when goods of which fortune is the cause come to be and exist for someone, either all, most, or the greatest of them. Fortune is the cause of some things that disciplines also cause, and many that have no discipline involved, such as those nature causes. Though it's possible for fortune's results to be contrary to nature. Skill is a cause of health, but nature of beauty and size. Generally, the goods from fortune are those that provoke envy. Fortune is also a cause of goods beyond reason. For instance, if someone's brothers are ugly but they're handsome, or if others didn't see the treasure but they found it, or if the missile hit the person next to them but not them, or if they alone didn't go somewhere they always frequented while others who went once were destroyed. All such things seem to be good fortune. Since the topic of praise is most closely connected to virtue, we'll define it when we discuss praise. Chapter 6 What we should aim at in urging as things that will be or are, and what in discouraging, as clear. They're the opposites of these. Since the deliberative speaker's target is the advantageous, people deliberate not about the end but about means to the end, which are advantageous actions, and the advantageous is good. We should grasp the basic elements about the good and advantageous in general. Let good be what's choice worthy for its own sake, that for the sake of which we choose other things, what everything, or everything with perception or intelligence, aims at, or would aim at if it acquired intelligence. What intelligence would grant to each thing, and what the intelligence concerning each individual grants to that individual. This is good for each. Also, that whose presence makes one well-disposed and self-sufficient, and self-sufficiency itself, and what's productive or protective of such things, and what such things follow upon, and what prevents or destroys their opposites. Things follow in two ways, either simultaneously or subsequently. Knowledge follows learning subsequently, but life follows health simultaneously. Things are productive in three ways. As being healthy produces health, as food produces health, or as exercise does because it usually produces health. Given these definitions, acquiring goods and losing evils must be good. Not having evil follows the latter simultaneously, having good follows the former subsequently. And replacing a lesser good with a greater, or a greater evil with a lesser. The amount by which the greater exceeds the lesser becomes acquisition of one and loss of the other. The virtues must also be good. Those who have them are in good condition because of them, and virtues are productive and practical of goods. We must speak separately about each, what it is and what sort. Pleasure too is good. All animals naturally aim at it. So pleasant things and beautiful things must be good. The former are productive of pleasure, and of beautiful things, some are pleasant, others choice-worthy in themselves. To list them individually, the following must be goods. Happiness, it's choice-worthy in itself and self-sufficient, and we choose other things for its sake. Justice, courage, temperance, magnificence, magnanimity, and similar states, they're virtues of the soul. Health, beauty, and such, they're bodily virtues and productive of many things. For instance, health produces both pleasure and life, which is why it seems best, because it causes the two things most people honor most, pleasure and life. Wealth, it's the excellence of possession and productive of many things. A friend and friendship, a friend is choice-worthy in himself and productive of many things. Honor and reputation, they're pleasant and productive of many things, and what people are honored for usually actually belongs to them. Ability in speaking and acting, all such things are productive of goods. Further, natural talent, memory, ease of learning, quick wit, all such things, these capacities are productive of goods. Likewise all sciences and crafts. And life, even if no other good followed from it, it's choice-worthy in itself. And justice, it's something advantageous for the community. These, then, are pretty much the agreed-upon goods. Syllogisms about disputed cases derive from the following. That whose opposite is bad is good. That whose opposite benefits enemies is good. For instance, if being cowardly especially benefits enemies, clearly courage especially helps citizens. Generally, what enemies want or what makes them happy, the opposite seems beneficial. Hence the saying, Priam would rejoice. But this isn't always so, just usually. Nothing prevents the same thing from sometimes benefiting opposing parties. Hence they say bad circumstances bring people together when the same thing is harmful to both. That which isn't in excess is good, what's greater than it should be is bad. That for which much labor or expense has been undertaken, it already appears good, and people assume such a thing is an end, and an end of many efforts. And the end is good. Hence the sayings. And they would leave a boast for Priam, and it's shameful to stay along. And the proverb about the water jar at the door. What many people aim at and what appears fought over, what everyone aims at was agreed to be good, and many people appear like everyone. What's praiseworthy, no one praises what's not good. What enemies and bad people praise, it's as if everyone agrees when even those badly affected by it agree. They would agree because it's obvious, just as those whom their friends blame and enemies don't blame are bad. That's why the Corinthians thought Simonides insulted them when he wrote, Troy doesn't blame the Corinthians. What someone prudent or good, man or woman, has preferred, like Athena choosing Odysseus, Theseus choosing Helen, the goddesses choosing Alexander, and Homer choosing Achilles. Generally, things that are deliberately chosen. People choose to do what's been mentioned, and things bad for enemies and good for friends, and things that are possible. The latter are of two kinds. Things that could happen and things that easily happen. Easy things are those without pain or taking little time. Difficulty is defined by pain or length of time. And things that happen as people wish. They wish either for no evil or for less evil than good. This happens when the penalty either goes unnoticed or is small. Things unique to them, which no one else has, and which are extraordinary, the honor is greater that way. Things that suit them, such things are what's fitting by birth and power, and things they think they lack, even if small, they choose to do these no less. Things easy to accomplish, because they're possible being easy. Easy things are those everyone, most people, peers or inferiors have accomplished. Things that will please friends or displease enemies. Things that those they admire choose to do. Things they're naturally good at and experienced in. They think they'll succeed more easily. Things no worthless person would do, they're more praiseworthy. Things they happen to desire, these seem not just pleasant but better. Most of all, each person prefers things related to what they love, victory if they love winning, honor if they love honor, money if they love money, and so on. So regarding the good and the advantageous, we must take our proofs from these points. Chapter 7. Since people often agree that both of two things are advantageous but dispute which is more so, we should next discuss the greater good and the more advantageous. Let exceeding mean as much and more, and exceeded mean what's contained in something else. Greater and more are always relative to less, while great and small, much, and little are relative to the size of most things. What exceeds is great, what falls short is small, and likewise for much and little. Since we call good what's choice-worthy for its own sake and not for something else. What everything aims at, what anything that acquired mind and prudence would choose. What's productive and protective are what such things follow from, and since that for the sake of which is the end, and the end is that for the sake of which other things are, and good for each individual is what stands in these relations to them, it necessarily follows that more things are a greater good than fewer, when the one or fewer are counted along with them, for it exceeds, and what's contained is exceeded. If the greatest thing of one type exceeds the greatest of another, the first type exceeds the second, and when one type exceeds another, the greatest of the first exceeds the greatest of the second. For instance, if the biggest man is bigger than the biggest woman, then men in general are bigger than women. And if men in general are bigger than women, then the biggest man is bigger than the biggest woman, for the superiority of types and their greatest members are proportional. When this follows from that but not vice versa, whether simultaneously, subsequently, or potentially, the second is greater. For the use of what follows is contained in that of the other. Things follow simultaneously, like life with health but not health with life, subsequently, like knowledge from learning, potentially, like theft from temple robbery. Whoever would rob a temple would also steal. Things exceeding the same thing by more are greater, they must also exceed the lesser. Things productive of a greater good are greater, that's what being productive of something greater means, and similarly, that whose producer is greater. If what's healthy is more choice-worthy than what's pleasant and a greater good, then health is greater than pleasure. What's choice-worthy in itself is greater than what's not, like strength and being healthy, for the latter isn't chosen for itself while the former is, which was our definition of good. If one thing is an end and another isn't, one is for its own sake, the other for something else, like exercising for physical fitness. What needs less addition is greater, it's more self-sufficient, what needs less is what needs fewer or easier additions. When one thing doesn't exist or can't come to be without another, but the second can without the first, what doesn't need something else is more self-sufficient, so it appears a greater good. If one thing is a first principle and another isn't, or if one is a cause and another isn't, for the same reason, without cause and first principle it's impossible to be or come to be. When there are two first principles, what comes from the greater is greater, and with two causes, what comes from the greater cause. And conversely, when there are two first principles, the first principle of the greater thing is greater, and with two causes, the cause of the greater is greater. It's clear from what's been said that something can appear greater in both ways. If one thing is a first principle and another isn't, the first will seem greater. And if one isn't a first principle but is an end, it will seem greater, for the end is greater, not the first principle. As Leodamas said when accusing Callistratus, the planner does more wrong than the doer. It wouldn't have happened without planning. Then again, against Chabrias, the doer more than the planner. It wouldn't have happened without someone to do it, since people make plans precisely so they'll be carried out. What's rarer is greater than what's abundant, like gold than iron, though less useful, acquisition is greater because more difficult. But in another way, the abundant is greater than the rare because its use exceeds. What's frequent exceeds what's seldom, hence the saying, water is best. Generally, what's more difficult is greater than what's easier, it's rarer. But in another way, the easier is greater than the more difficult, it's as we wish it to be. That whose opposite is greater, or whose lack is greater, is greater. Virtue is greater than non-virtue, and vice than non-vice. The former are ends, the latter not. Things whose effects are nobler or more shameful are greater. Things whose virtues and vices are greater produce greater effects, since as causes and first principles are, so are results, and as results are, so are causes and first principles. Things whose superiority is more choice-worthy or nobler, for instance, precise sight is more choice-worthy than smell, and sight than smell. And being very friend-loving than being very money-loving is nobler. So love of friends is nobler than love of money. And conversely, the excesses of better things are better and of nobler things nobler. Things of which the desires are nobler are better, for greater appetites are for greater things. And for the same reason, the desires for nobler or better things are nobler and better. If the knowledge of some things is nobler or more serious, the things themselves are nobler and more serious. As knowledge is, so is truth. Each knowledge commands its own subject. And by analogy, the knowledge of more serious and nobler things is more serious and noble for the same reason. What prudent people, either all, most, or the best, would judge or have judged to be a greater good must be so, either simply or insofar as they judged according to prudence. This is common to other things too. The what, how much, and of what sort are as knowledge and prudence would say. But we've stated this about goods. Good was defined as what anything that acquired prudence would choose. So it's clear that what prudence more affirms is a greater good. What belongs to better people, either simply or insofar as they're better, like courage than strength. What the better person would choose, either simply or insofar as they're better, like suffering injustice rather than doing it, for that's what the more just person would choose. The more pleasant rather than the less pleasant. Everything pursues pleasure and aims to feel pleasure for its own sake. These are how we've defined the good in the end. More pleasant is what's less painful and pleasant for longer. The nobler than the less noble. The noble is either the pleasant or what's choice-worthy in itself. Things people want to be causes of for themselves or friends are greater goods, and things they least want are greater evils. Things that last longer than those lasting less time, and things more secure than less secure. The use of the former exceeds in time, of the latter in wish. The use of secure things is available whenever one wishes. As coordinate terms and similar inflections follow, so do other things. For instance, if courageously is nobler and more choice-worthy than temperately, then courage is more choice-worthy than temperance, and being courageous than being temperate. What everyone chooses rather than not everyone, and what more rather than fewer choose. Good was what everyone aims at, so the greater good is what they aim at more. And what opponents or enemies choose, or what judges or those whom judges select choose. The one case is as if everyone says so, the other is what those with authority and knowledge say. Sometimes a greater good is what everyone shares in. It's dishonorable not to share. Sometimes what no one or few have, it's rarer. Things more praiseworthy, since they're nobler. Things with greater honors are similarly greater. Honor is like a kind of worth. Things with greater penalties. Things greater than what's agreed or appears to be great. The same things appear greater when divided into parts. They appear to exceed in more ways. Hence the poet says Meleager was persuaded to rise up by all the evils that come to people whose city is taken. The people perish, fire levels the city, others lead away the children. Combining and building up, as Epicharmus does, for the same reason as division, combination shows great superiority, and because it appears to be the origin and cause of great things. Since the more difficult and rarer is greater, occasions, ages, places, times, and powers make things great. If someone does things beyond their power, age, or peers, or if done in a certain way, place, or time, they'll have greatness of noble, good, or just things and their opposites. Hence the epigram for the Olympic victor. Formerly, with a rough yoke on my shoulders, I carried fish from Argos to Tegea. And Iphicrates praised himself, saying, from what beginnings I achieved these things. What's natural is greater than what's acquired, since it's more difficult. Hence the poet says, I am self-taught. The greatest part of something great, as Pericles said in the funeral oration, the youth taken from the city was like the spring taken from the year. Things useful in greater need, like in old age and illnesses. Of two things, what's closer to the end? What's good for someone specifically rather than generally? What's possible rather than impossible? One is useful to the person, the other not. Things at life's end, things near the end are more like ends. What aims at truth more than reputation? The definition of what aims at reputation is what someone wouldn't choose if it were going to be hidden. That's why receiving benefits might seem more choice-worthy than doing them. One would choose to receive even if hidden, but it seems one wouldn't choose to do good deeds in secret. Things people want to really be rather than seem, they aim more at truth. That's why they say justice is a small thing, because seeming just is more choice-worthy than being just. Not so with being healthy. What's more useful for multiple purposes, like what contributes to life, living well, pleasure, and doing noble deeds. That's why wealth and health seem greatest, they have all these. What's less painful and accompanied by pleasure? It's more than one thing, since both pleasure is present as a good and absence of pain. Of two things, that which added to the same thing makes the whole greater. Things whose presence is noticed rather than overlooked, they tend more toward truth. So being wealthy might appear a greater good than seeming wealthy. What's cherished, both when it's someone's only possession and when they have other things too. That's why the penalty isn't equal for blinding a one-eyed person versus someone with two eyes. Something cherished has been taken away. We've now pretty much stated the sources from which we should draw proofs in urging and discouraging. Chapter 8. The most important and authoritative factor for being able to persuade and give good advice is to grasp all forms of constitution and distinguish each one's customs, laws, and advantages. Everyone is persuaded by what's advantageous, and what preserves the constitution is advantageous. Moreover, the decision of the authority is authoritative, and authorities are distinguished according to constitutions. There are as many authorities as there are constitutions. There are 4 constitutions: democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, and monarchy. So the authoritative and deciding element would always be some part or whole of these. Democracy is a constitution where offices are distributed by lot. Oligarchy where they go to those with property qualifications. Aristocracy where they go according to education. By education I mean that laid down by law. Those who have remained within the law's rule in an aristocracy. These must appear best, which is where this constitution gets its name. Monarchy is where, as the name indicates, one person has authority over everything. Of monarchies, kingship follows some arrangement while tyranny is unlimited. We shouldn't overlook the end of each constitution. People choose what contributes to the end. The end of democracy is freedom, of oligarchy wealth, of aristocracy things related to education and law, of tyranny self-protection. Clearly, we must distinguish the customs, laws, and advantages that relate to each constitution's end, since people make choices by referring to this. Since proofs come not only through demonstrative argument but also through character, we trust a speaker when they appear to be a certain kind of person, that is, good, well-disposed, or both. We should understand each constitution's character. Each constitution's own character must be most persuasive for it. These characters will be grasped through the same means. Characters are revealed through deliberate choice, and deliberate choice refers to the end. We've now discussed what future or present things we should aim at when urging, from what sources we should take proofs about the advantageous, and the characters and laws of constitutions, and through what means we'll have resources, as far as was appropriate for the present occasion. These matters are discussed precisely in the Politics. Chapter 9. Next, let's discuss virtue and vice, the noble and the shameful. These are the targets for those who praise and blame. In discussing these, we'll also clarify how we can be perceived as having certain character traits, which was the second form of proof. Using the same methods, we'll be able to make ourselves and others appear trustworthy regarding virtue. Since we often praise not just people but also gods, and even inanimate objects and animals, whether seriously or not, we should gather premises about these things in the same way. So let's discuss these matters, at least for the sake of example. The noble is what's choice-worthy for its own sake and praiseworthy, or what's good and pleasant because it's good. If this is what's noble, then virtue must be noble, since it's good and praiseworthy. Virtue seems to be a capacity for acquiring and preserving good things, a capacity for conferring many great benefits, indeed, all benefits on all matters. The parts of virtue are justice, courage, temperance, magnificence, magnanimity, generosity, prudence, and wisdom. The greatest virtues must be those most useful to others, if virtue is indeed a capacity for conferring benefits. That's why we especially honor the just and the courageous. Courage is useful to others in war. Justice in both war and peace. Next comes generosity, since generous people give freely and don't fight over money, which others especially desire. Justice is the virtue through which each person has what belongs to them, as the law prescribes. Injustice is when someone has what belongs to others, contrary to law. Courage is the virtue that makes people doers of noble deeds in danger, as the law commands, serving the law. Cowardice is the opposite. Temperance is the virtue regarding bodily pleasures, disposing people as the law commands. Intemperance is the opposite. Generosity does good regarding money. Stinginess is the opposite. Magnanimity is the virtue that produces great benefactions. Small-mindedness is the opposite. Magnificence is the virtue that produces grandeur in expenditures. Pettiness and shabbiness are the opposites. Prudence is intellectual virtue enabling good deliberation about the goods and evils mentioned regarding happiness. We've now said enough about virtue and vice in general and their parts for the present occasion. It's not hard to see the rest. Clearly, things that produce virtue must be noble, since they tend toward virtue, as must things that come from virtue. These include both the signs and works of virtue. Since the signs of good things and whatever comes from or is done by good people are noble, it follows that all works of courage, signs of courage, or things done courageously must be noble. So too with just things and just works, though not necessarily things justly suffered. In this virtue alone, being justly punished is more shameful than being unjustly punished. The same applies to the other virtues. Things for which the reward is honor are noble, as are things done for honor rather than money. Also, when someone does choice-worthy things not for their own sake. Things that are simply good, like what someone does for their country while disregarding their own interest. Things good by nature. Things that aren't good for the doer personally. Such things are done for their own sake. Things more likely to exist after death than in life. What's done in life has more self-interest. Works done for others' sake. They're less selfish. Success regarding others rather than oneself, and success for one's benefactors. That's just. Benefactions, they're not directed at oneself. The opposites of shameful things are noble. People are ashamed of shameful things whether they're saying, doing, or intending them. As Sappho wrote when Alcaeus said, "I want to say something, but shame prevents me." If you desired noble or beautiful things and your tongue weren't stirring up something evil to say, shame wouldn't hold your eyes, but you'd speak about what's just. Things people fight for without fear are noble. They have this feeling about goods that contribute to reputation. The virtues and works of those naturally more serious are nobler, like those of men rather than women. Things more enjoyable to others than oneself. That's why justice and what's just are noble. Taking revenge on enemies and not being reconciled. Reciprocation is just, and what's just is noble, and not being defeated is characteristic of courage. Victory and honor are among noble things. They're choice-worthy even when fruitless, and they show superiority in virtue. Memorable things are noble, and the more memorable, the nobler. Things that follow us after death. Things accompanied by honor. Extraordinary things. Things that belong to one person alone are nobler. They're more memorable. Possessions that bring no profit. They're more befitting a free person. Customs particular to each people are noble, and whatever is a sign of what's praised among them. For instance, in Sparta having long hair is noble. It's a sign of freedom, since it's not easy to do menial work with long hair. Not practicing any mechanical craft. It's characteristic of a free person not to live for another. We should take things close to actual qualities as if they were the same, for both praise and blame. For instance, call the cautious person cold and scheming, the simpleton honest, the insensitive mild. Always derive each quality from what accompanies it in the best direction, the hot-tempered and manic as straightforward, the arrogant as magnificent and dignified. Treat those in the extremes as if they were in the virtues, the rash as courageous, the prodigal as generous. This will seem true to most people, and it's also a fallacy from cause. If someone takes risks unnecessarily, they'll seem even more likely to do so when it's noble. If they're lavish with anyone, they'll be so with friends. The extreme of virtue is doing good to everyone. Consider also the audience for the praise. As Socrates said, it's not hard to praise Athenians among Athenians. One should speak of whatever is honored among each group as if it actually exists. Whether among Scythians, Spartans, or philosophers. Generally, lead what's honored toward what's noble, since they seem to be neighbors. Whatever is according to what's fitting, if worthy of one's ancestors and previous achievements. It's a mark of happiness and noble to acquire additional honor. Also, if someone goes beyond what's fitting but toward what's better and nobler. Like being moderate in good fortune but great-souled in misfortune, or becoming better and more conciliatory as one becomes greater. Such was Iphicrates' saying, "Look where I started and where I am now," and the Olympic victor's inscription, "Formerly with a rough yoke on my shoulders," and Simonides', "She who was daughter of a father, husband, and brothers who were tyrants." Since praise comes from actions, and acting according to deliberate choice is characteristic of the good person, we should try to show someone acting from deliberate choice. It's useful if they appear to have acted this way many times. That's why coincidences and chance events should be taken as deliberate. If many similar things are presented, they'll seem to be signs of virtue and deliberate choice. Praise is speech that manifests the greatness of virtue. So we must show that actions have this quality. Encomium is of deeds. Circumstances like good birth and education contribute to proof, since good people likely come from good stock, and someone raised a certain way is likely to be that way. That's why we compose encomiums for those who have acted. Deeds are signs of one's state. We'd praise even someone who hadn't acted, if we believed they were that type of person. Blessing and calling someone happy are the same as each other but not the same as praise and encomium. Just as happiness contains virtue, blessing contains these. Praise and advice have a common form. What you'd propose in giving advice becomes encomium when you change the expression. When we know what one should do and what sort of person one should be, we should state these as suggestions, then change and turn the expression. For instance, saying, "One shouldn't take pride in what comes from fortune but in what comes from oneself," stated this way, it has the force of a suggestion, but like this it's praise. Taking pride not in what comes from fortune but in what comes from oneself. So when you want to praise, see what you would suggest. When you want to suggest, see what you would praise. The expression will necessarily be opposite when one changes between forbidding and not forbidding. We should also use many amplifying factors. If someone did something alone, or first, or with few others, or did it most of all. All these things are noble. Arguments from times and occasions, these count if beyond what's expected. If someone often achieved the same success, that's great and would seem to come not from fortune but through oneself. If incentives and honors were invented and established because of this person. If they were the first to receive an encomium, like Hippolochus, or if statues were set up in the marketplace, like for Harmodius and Aristogiton. Similarly with opposites. If you don't have enough material about the person themselves, compare them with others, which is what Isocrates did due to his inexperience with lawsuits. You should compare with famous people. It's amplifying and noble if someone is better than serious people. Amplification reasonably falls under epideictic speeches, since it deals with superiority, and superiority is among noble things. That's why even if you can't compare someone with famous people, you should compare them with others, since superiority seems to indicate virtue. Of the forms common to all speeches, amplification is most suitable for epideictic. They take the actions as agreed upon, so what remains is to invest them with grandeur and nobility. Examples suit deliberative speeches. We judge the future by divining from the past. Enthymemes suit forensic speeches. What has happened, being unclear, especially admits of cause and demonstration. This covers what nearly all praise and blame are derived from, what we should look to when praising or blaming, and what encomiums and reproaches come from. Having these, their opposites are clear. Blame comes from the opposites. Chapter 10 regarding accusation and defense, we should next discuss how many and what kinds of syllogisms to construct. We need to grasp three things. First, for what and how many reasons people do injustice. Second, how they're disposed when they do it. Third, what sorts of people they wrong and in what condition these people are. Let's define doing injustice and then discuss things in order. Let doing injustice be voluntarily harming someone contrary to law. Law is either particular or common. By particular I mean what's written down according to which people govern themselves. By common, what seems to be agreed upon by everyone though unwritten. People act voluntarily when they know what they're doing and aren't forced. Not everything done knowingly is done from deliberate choice, but everything done from deliberate choice is done knowingly. No one is ignorant of what they deliberately choose. The reasons people deliberately choose to harm others and do bad things contrary to law are vice and lack of self-control. If people have some fault, one or more, they're also unjust regarding whatever they're faulty about. The stingy person regarding money, the self-indulgent regarding bodily pleasures, the soft regarding easy things, the coward regarding dangers. They abandon those in danger with them through fear, the honor lover because of honor, the hot-tempered through anger, the competitive through victory, the bitter through revenge, the foolish through being deceived about justice and injustice, the shameless through contempt for reputation. Similarly, each type is faulty regarding their respective objects. But this is clear partly from what's been said about the virtues, partly from what will be said about the emotions. It remains to say for what reasons, in what state, and to whom people do injustice. First, let's distinguish what people aim at and what they avoid when they attempt injustice. Obviously, the prosecutor must consider how many and which of these things that everyone who wrongs their neighbor's desires apply to the opponent. The defendant, which and how many don't apply. Everyone does everything either not through themselves or through themselves. Of things not done through themselves, some are done by chance, others from necessity. Of those from necessity, some are by force, others by nature. So everything people do not through themselves is done either by chance, by nature, or by force. What they do through themselves and cause themselves is done either through habit or through desire, either rational or irrational desire. Wish is a desire for good. No one wishes for something unless they think it's good. Irrational desires are anger and appetite. So people must do everything they do for one of 7 causes: chance, nature, force, habit, reasoning, anger, or appetite. It's superfluous to further distinguish actions by age, states, or other factors. If young people happen to be hot-tempered or appetitive, they don't do such things because of youth but because of anger and appetite. Nor do people act because of wealth and poverty, though the poor happen to desire money due to need, and the rich desire unnecessary pleasures due to excess, but they'll act not because of wealth and poverty but because of appetite. Similarly, the just and unjust, and others said to act according to their states, will act through these causes, either through reasoning or emotion, some through good characters and emotions, others through the opposites. It does happen that such and such states are accompanied by such and such qualities. Perhaps immediately the temperate person, because of being temperate, has good opinions and desires about pleasant things, while the intemperate has opposite ones about the same things. Therefore we should leave aside such distinctions and examine instead what usually follows what. If someone is white or black, large or small, nothing definite is determined to follow, but if young or old, just or unjust, it makes a difference. And generally, all the circumstances that make people's characters differ, thinking oneself rich or poor will make some difference, and so will thinking oneself fortunate or unfortunate. We'll discuss these later. Now let's first discuss the remaining points. Things that happen by chance are those whose cause is indefinite, that don't happen for the sake of something, and happen neither always nor usually nor in an orderly way. This is clear from the definition of chance. Things that happen by nature are those whose cause is in themselves and ordered, they turn out either always or usually the same way. For things contrary to nature, there's no need to investigate precisely whether they happen according to nature or some other cause. Chance would also seem to be the cause of such things. By force, what happens contrary to the desires or reasoning of the doers themselves? By habit, what people do because they've often done it. Through reasoning, things that seem advantageous from the goods mentioned, either as an end or as means to an end, when done because they're advantageous. Even the intemperate do some advantageous things, but not because they're advantageous but for pleasure. Through anger and temper come acts of revenge. Revenge differs from punishment. Punishment is for the sake of the sufferer, revenge for the sake of the doer, to be satisfied. What angers will be clear in the discussion of emotions. Through appetite are done things that seem pleasant. The familiar and habitual are among pleasant things. Many things not naturally pleasant people do with pleasure when they've become accustomed to them. In summary, everything people do through themselves is either good or apparently good, pleasant or apparently pleasant. Since what people do through themselves they do voluntarily, and what they don't do through themselves involuntarily, everything done voluntarily would be either good or apparently good, pleasant or apparently pleasant. I include escaping evils or apparent evils, or exchanging greater for lesser ones among goods. They're somewhat choice-worthy. And escaping painful things or apparently painful things, or exchanging greater for lesser pains, similarly among pleasant things. We must then grasp what's advantageous and pleasant, how many kinds there are and what they're like. About the advantageous, we've spoken earlier in discussing deliberative rhetoric. Let's now discuss the pleasant. We should consider definitions adequate if they're neither unclear nor overly precise about each matter. Chapter 11 Let's assume that pleasure is a certain movement of the soul and a simultaneous perceptible settling into its underlying nature, and pain the opposite. If pleasure is this sort of thing, clearly what's pleasant is what produces this mentioned disposition, while what destroys it or produces the opposite settling is painful. It's necessary, then, that it's pleasant generally to move toward what's natural, especially when things happening according to nature have recovered their own nature. Habits are also pleasant. What's habitual becomes as if natural, since habit is somewhat like nature. What happens often is close to what happens always. Nature belongs to the always, habit to the often. What's not forced is pleasant, force is contrary to nature. That's why what's necessary is painful, and it's correctly said, every necessary thing is naturally grievous. Careful attention, serious effort, and intense exertion are painful. These are necessary and forced unless one becomes habituated, and then habit makes them pleasant. Their opposites are pleasant, relaxations, rests, carelessness, games, recreations, and sleep are among pleasant things, since none of these involves necessity. Everything for which there's appetite is pleasant, since appetite is desire for the pleasant. Some appetites are irrational, others accompanied by reason. I call irrational those desires people have without conceiving of the object, all those said to exist by nature, like those from the body. Thirst and hunger for food, a particular kind of desire for each kind of food, desires connected with taste and sex and touch generally, with smell and hearing and sight. Desires accompanied by reason are those people have from being persuaded. They desire to see and possess many things after hearing about them and being persuaded. Since being pleased consists in perceiving a certain affection, and imagination is a kind of weak perception, someone remembering or hoping would be accompanied by some imagination of what they remember or hope. If this is so, clearly there are pleasures for those remembering and hoping, since there's perception. So all pleasant things must be either present in perceiving, past in remembering, or future and hoping. We perceive present things, remember past ones, hope for future ones. Things remembered are pleasant not only when they were pleasant when present, but sometimes even things not pleasant then, if what came after was noble and good. Hence the saying, sweet it is when saved to remember troubles, and, for a man rejoices afterward even in sorrows, remembering how much he suffered and did. The reason is that not having evil is pleasant. Things hoped for are pleasant when their presence seems to bring great delight or benefit without pain. Generally, things that delight when present also usually delight those hoping for or remembering them. That's why being angry is pleasant, as Homer wrote about spirit, which is much sweeter than dripping honey. No one gets angry at someone who apparently can't be punished, and we're less angry or not at all with those far above us in power. Most appetites involve some pleasure, remembering how they attained something or hoping they'll attain it, they enjoy a certain pleasure. Those gripped by fever delight in remembering drinking and hoping to drink. Lovers always delight in talking, writing, or doing something concerning the beloved. In all such things, remembering makes them seem to perceive the beloved. This is the beginning of love for everyone, when they delight not just in the beloved's presence but remember them when absent and feel pain at their absence. Similarly, there's a certain pleasure even in mourning and lamentation. The pain is for the person's absence, but there's pleasure in remembering and somehow seeing them, what they did and what they were like. Hence it's reasonably said, thus he spoke, and stirred up in all of them a desire for weeping. Taking revenge is pleasant. What's painful not to attain is pleasant to attain. Angry people are pained beyond measure when they don't get revenge, but hoping for it delights them. Victory is pleasant not only for those who love victory but for everyone. An impression of superiority arises, for which everyone has desire, gently or strongly. Since victory is pleasant, competitive and contentious games must be pleasant. Victory often occurs in these, as well as knucklebones, ball, dice, and checkers. It's the same with serious games. Some become pleasant through familiarity, others are immediately pleasant, like hunting and every kind of chase. Where there's competition, there's victory. That's why forensic and heuristic contests are pleasant for those accustomed to them and capable. Honor and reputation are among the most pleasant things because everyone imagines they're such as a serious person would be, especially when those they think tell the truth say so. Such are neighbors more than those far away, associates and fellow citizens more than those from afar, contemporaries more than future generations, the prudent more than the imprudent, many rather than few. It's more likely that the mentioned groups tell the truth than their opposites. Since no one cares about the honor or opinion from those they greatly look down upon, like children or animals. At least not for the opinion's own sake. If they do care, it's for some other reason. A friend is among pleasant things. Loving is pleasant. No wine lover doesn't delight in wine, and being loved is pleasant. Here too there's an impression that one is good, which all who perceive it desire. Being loved is being cherished for oneself. Being admired is pleasant for the same reason as being honored. Being flattered and having a flatterer are pleasant. The flatterer is an apparent admirer and apparent friend. Doing the same things often is pleasant. The habitual was said to be pleasant. Changing is also pleasant. Change is into one's natural state, since the same thing all the time creates an excess of the established condition. Hence it said, change in all things is sweet. This is why what comes at intervals is pleasant, both people and things. It's a change from the present, and also what comes at intervals is rare. Learning and wondering are usually pleasant. In wondering there's desiring to learn, so the wonderful is desirable. In learning there's a settling into one's natural state. Benefiting and being benefited are among pleasant things. Being benefited is getting what one desires. Benefiting is having and exceeding, both of which people aim at. Because benefiting is pleasant, people find it pleasant to set their neighbors right and to complete what's lacking. Since learning and wondering are pleasant, things like imitation must also be pleasant, painting, sculpture, poetry, and everything well imitated, even if what's imitated isn't pleasant itself. It's not the object that delights, but the inference that this is that, so one learns something. Reversals and narrow escapes from danger are pleasant. All these are wonderful. Since what's natural is pleasant, and related things are natural to each other, all related and similar things are usually pleasant to each other. Human to human, horse to horse, youth to youth. Hence the proverbs. Age delights age, like to like, beast knows beast, jackdaw to jackdaw, and so on. Since everything similar and related to oneself is pleasant, and each person especially feels this way about themselves, everyone must be self-loving to some degree. All such relationships exist especially toward oneself. Since everyone is self-loving, One's own things must be pleasant to everyone. One's works and words. That's why people are usually fond of flatterers, lovers, honor, and children. Children are their own work. Completing what's incomplete is pleasant. It becomes one's own work. Since ruling is most pleasant, seeming wise is also pleasant, practical wisdom is ruling, and wisdom is knowledge of many wonderful things. Further, since people are generally ambitious, it must be pleasant to criticize neighbors and to rule. Also spending time where one seems to be at one's best, as the poet says. To this he hurries, allotting the greatest part of each day to where he happens to be at his best. Similarly, since play and all relaxation are among pleasant things, laughter must be pleasant, people, words, and deeds that are laughable. Laughable things are defined separately in the Poetics. So much for pleasant things. Painful things are clear from their opposites. Chapter 12. These are the reasons people do injustice. Let's now discuss how they're disposed when they do it and whom they wrong. People attempt injustice when they think the thing is possible to be done and possible for them, either that they'll escape notice doing it, or won't escape notice but won't pay a penalty, or will pay a penalty but it will be less than the gain for themselves or those they care about. What seems possible and impossible will be discussed later. These are common to all speeches. Those who especially think they can do injustice without penalty are those capable of speaking, the practical, those experienced in many contests, if they have many friends, and if they're wealthy. They especially think they can if they themselves are in these mentioned conditions. If not, if they have friends, servants, or partners who are. Through these they can act, escape notice, and avoid penalty. Also if they're friends with those wronged or with the judges. Friends are unguarded against being wronged and are reconciled before prosecuting. Judges favor their friends, either completely acquitting them or imposing small penalties. Those likely to escape notice are those opposite to the charges, the weak regarding assault, the poor and ugly regarding adultery. Also things done completely openly and in sight. These are unguarded against because no one would believe them. Things so great are of such a kind that no one would believe them. These too are unguarded against. Everyone guards against usual things, like diseases, and usual injustices, but no one takes precautions against a disease no one has yet had. Those who have no enemies or many enemies, the former think they'll escape notice because they're not watched, the latter escape notice because it wouldn't seem they'd attack those on guard and they have the defense that they wouldn't have attempted it. Those who have ways to conceal things, by methods, places, or easy disposal. Those who, if they don't escape notice, can push off trial or delay it or corrupt the judges. Those who, if a penalty is imposed, can push off payment or delay it for a long time, or who through poverty have nothing to lose. Those for whom the gains are manifest, great, or near, while the penalties are small, unclear, or distant. Where the punishment isn't equal to the benefit, as tyranny seems to be. Those whose unjust acts bring gains while the penalties are only disgrace. Conversely, those whose unjust acts lead to some praise. If it happens they're simultaneously avenging a father or mother, like Zeno. While the penalties are fines, exile, or such. People do injustice for both reasons and both dispositions, though not the same people but those with opposite characters. Those who have often escaped notice are gone unpunished, and those who have often failed. Some people are like those in war who are willing to fight again. Those for whom the pleasure is immediate but the pain later, or the gain immediate but the penalty later. The incontinent are like this, and incontinence concerns everything people desire. Those for whom the pain or penalty is immediate but the pleasure and benefit come later and last longer. The self-controlled and more prudent pursue such things. Those who can seem to have acted through chance, necessity, nature, or habit, in general, to have made a mistake rather than done injustice. Those who can obtain consideration. Those in need. But people are in need in two ways. Either of necessities, like the poor, or of excess, like the rich. Those with very good reputations and those with very bad ones. The former as unlikely to be suspected, the latter as no worse off. So disposed, people do injustice to these sorts of people and things. Those who have what they themselves need, whether for necessities, excess, or enjoyment. Both those far away and those nearby. Taking from the former is quick, punishment from the latter slow, like those who plunder the Carthaginians. Those not cautious or watchful but trusting. It's easy to escape everyone's notice. The easygoing, it takes effort to prosecute. The bashful, they won't fight over profit. Those wronged by many who haven't prosecuted, these are, as the proverb says, miege and plunder. Those never yet wronged and those often wronged. Both are unguarded, the former as never having been, the latter as not likely to be again. Those who have been slandered or are easy to slander, such people neither choose to prosecute, fearing the judges, nor can they persuade, being hated and envied. Those against whom one has a pretext that ancestors, themselves, or friends did or were about to do evil to them, their ancestors, or those they care for, as the proverb says, wickedness needs only a pretext. Both enemies and friends, it's easy with the latter, pleasant with the former. Those without friends, those not clever at speaking or action, they either don't attempt prosecution, or are reconciled, or accomplish nothing. Those for whom it's not profitable to waste time waiting for trial or compensation, like foreigners and laborers, they settle for little and easily desist. Those who have done many injustices are the same sort they're suffering. It seems close to no injustice when someone suffers the sort of thing they themselves usually do. I mean, like assaulting someone who usually commits hubris. Those who have done, wanted to do, intend to do, or will do evil, it has both pleasure and nobility, and seems close to no injustice. Those by wronging whom one will gratify friends, those one admires, those one loves, one's masters, or generally those on whom one's life depends. Those toward whom one can obtain equitable consideration. Those one has already accused and been separated from, like Callippus did regarding Dion. Such things seem close to no injustice. Those who are about to be wronged by others if one doesn't act first, as no longer being able to deliberate. As they say, Anicedemus sent gaming pieces to Gelon when he enslaved someone, because he did it first when Anicedemus was about to. Those by wronging whom one will be able to do many just things, as easily curing the wrong, as Jason the Thessalian said one should do some injustices to be able to do many just things. Things everyone or many are accustomed to do wrong, one expects to obtain pardon. Things easy to hide, what's quickly consumed, like food, what's easily changed in shape, color, or mixture. What can easily be made to disappear in many places. Things easily carried and hidden in small spaces. Things of which the wrongdoer already has many indistinguishable similar items. Things the victims are ashamed to mention, like outrages to women of their household or to themselves or their sons. Things where prosecuting would seem litigious, small matters and things usually pardoned. These, then, are pretty much the conditions in which people do injustice, the sorts of things they do, to whom, and why. Chapter 13 Let's distinguish all unjust and just acts, beginning first from this point. Justice and injustice have been defined in relation to two kinds of law and in two ways regarding those they concern. I mean law that's either particular or common. Particular is what's defined by each group for themselves, either unwritten or written. Common is what accords with nature. There's something everyone divines to be commonly just or unjust by nature, even with no mutual association or agreement. This is what Sophocles' Antigone evidently means, saying it's just to bury Polynices though forbidden, as this is naturally just. Not now and yesterday, but always ever this lives, and no one knows from where it appeared. As Empedocles says about not killing living things, this isn't just for some and not others. But the law for all extends continuously through wide ruling sky and boundless light. And as Alcidamas says in the Messenian speech, God has left all people free, nature has made no one a slave. Regarding those affected, the distinction is twofold. What one should do or not do is defined either toward the community or toward one of its individual members. Therefore it's possible to do injustice and act justly in two ways. Either toward a specific individual or toward the community. The adulterer and assailant wrongs a specific individual, the draft dodger wrongs the community. With all unjust acts distinguished, some toward the community, others toward one or more individuals, let's take up again what it is to be wronged and proceed. Being wronged is suffering unjust things from someone acting voluntarily. Doing injustice was earlier defined as voluntary. Since the wronged person is necessarily harmed and harmed involuntarily, harms are clear from what was said before. Good and bad things in themselves were discussed earlier, as were voluntary acts, those done knowingly. So all accusations are necessarily either toward the community or toward an individual, with the accused either ignorant and unwilling or willing and knowing, and of the latter, some acting from choice, others from passion. We'll discuss anger when we discuss the emotions. What people choose and how they're disposed was discussed earlier. Since people often agree they've done something but don't agree about the specification the charge falls under, for instance. They agree they took something but not that they stole, that they struck first but didn't commit outrage, that they had intercourse but not adultery, that they stole but not temple robbery, it wasn't the god's property, that they trespassed but not on public land, that they conversed with enemies but didn't commit treason. We should define what theft is, what outrage is, what adultery is, so that if we want to show something is or isn't the case, we can make the justice clear. All such disputes are about whether someone is unjust and wicked or not unjust. Wickedness and doing injustice lie in the deliberate choice, and terms like outrage and theft additionally signify deliberate choice. If someone struck, they didn't in every case commit outrage, but only if for some purpose, like dishonoring the other or enjoying themselves. Nor if someone took something secretly did they in every case steal, but only if to harm the person from whom they took and to appropriate for themselves. It's the same with other cases as with these. Since there were two kinds of just and unjust things, some written, some unwritten, we've discussed those about which the laws speak. Of unwritten there are two kinds. First are those involving excessive virtue or vice, which bring reproach and praise, dishonor and honor and gifts. Like being grateful to a benefactor and returning good for good, being helpful to friends, and other such things. The other kind is what's missing from particular written law. The equitable seems to be just, and equity is justice that goes beyond written law. This happens sometimes with and sometimes without the lawmaker's intention. Without when it escapes their notice, with it when they can't define things precisely but must speak universally, though that's not accurate but only usual, and all the things not easy to define due to their infinity, like wounding with iron. What size and type? A lifetime wouldn't suffice to enumerate them. If something is indefinite but legislation is needed, one must speak simply, so that if someone wearing a ring raises their hand or strikes, according to written law they're guilty and do injustice, but according to truth they don't do injustice. This is equity. If equity is what we've said, it's clear what things are equitable and not equitable, and what people are not equitable. Things deserving sympathetic consideration are equitable. Not treating mistakes and injustices as equal, nor mistakes and misfortunes. Misfortunes are unexpected things not from wickedness. Mistakes are not unexpected and not from wickedness. Injustices are not unexpected and are from wickedness. Things done through appetite are from wickedness. Forgiving human failings is equitable. Looking not to the law but to the lawgiver, not to the letter but to the intention of the lawgiver, not to the action but to the choice, not to the part but to the whole, not what sort of person someone is now but what they've always or usually been. Remembering good rather than evil one has suffered, and good one has suffered rather than done. Bearing injustice patiently. Preferring judgment by reason rather than by deed. Being willing to go to arbitration rather than to court. The arbitrator sees what's equitable, the juror only the law. Arbitration was invented for this reason, so that equity might prevail. Let this be our definition of equitable matters, chapter 14. An injustice is greater the injustice it comes from. That's why the smallest acts can be the greatest. Like when Callistratus prosecuted Melanopus for defrauding the temple builders of 3 half-o bulls. With justice it's the opposite. This is because the potential is present. Someone who would steal 3 sacred half-o bulls would do anything unjust. Sometimes the greater injustice is judged this way, sometimes from the harm. Injustice for which there's no equal punishment, but all are too small. For which there's no cure, it's difficult and impossible. Where the victim can't get legal satisfaction, it's incurable, since trial and punishment are a cure. If the wronged victim severely punished himself, the perpetrator deserves even greater punishment. As Sophocles said, speaking for Euctemon after he killed himself when outraged, he wouldn't assess a penalty less than the victim assessed for himself. What someone has done alone or first or with few others. Making the same mistake repeatedly is serious. Things that lead to seeking and discovering preventions and punishments. In Argos, they punish anyone who causes a law to be passed, and those for whom the prison was built. The more bestial crime is greater. What's more premeditated? What hearers fear more than pity? Rhetorical considerations include destroying or transgressing many things, oaths, pledges, sureties, marriages. This is an excess of many injustices. Injustice where wrongdoers are punished. What false witnesses do. Where would they not do injustice if they do it even in court? Things bringing the most shame. Wronging someone from whom one has received benefits. One does more injustice both by doing evil and not doing good. Violating unwritten laws of justice. It's characteristic of a better person to be just without necessity. Written laws involve necessity, unwritten don't. In another way, violating written laws. Someone who does injustice where there are fearful penalties will also do it where there aren't. So much for greater and lesser injustice, chapter 15. Following what's been said, let's run through the so-called non-technical proofs. These are peculiar to forensic speeches. They're 5 in number. Laws, witnesses, contracts, evidence from torture, oaths. First, let's discuss laws, how to use them when urging or discouraging, prosecuting or defending. Clearly, if the written law is contrary to our case, we must use common law and more equitable and just arguments. We must say that best judgment means not using written laws exclusively. That equity always remains and never changes, nor does common law, it's according to nature, but written laws often change. Hence what's said in Sophocles' Antigone. She defends herself saying she buried him contrary to Creon's law but not contrary to unwritten law. Not now and yesterday, but always ever, I wasn't about to, for any man. That justice is true and advantageous, but not what merely seems so written law isn't really law, it doesn't do law's work. The judge is like an assayer of silver, to distinguish counterfeit from true justice. It's characteristic of a better person to use and abide by unwritten rather than written laws. See if the law contradicts another approved law or even itself. Sometimes one law says agreements should be authoritative, another forbids making agreements contrary to law. If it's ambiguous, so one can turn it and see which interpretation fits justice or advantage, then use that. If the circumstances for which the law was established no longer exist but the law remains, one should try to make this clear and fight the law this way. If the written law supports our case, we must say that best judgment isn't for judging contrary to the law but so that one doesn't commit perjury if one doesn't understand what the law says. That no one chooses what's simply good but what's good for themselves. That there's no difference between having no law and not using it. That in other arts it doesn't pay to be cleverer than the doctor. The doctor's error harms less than becoming accustomed to disobeying authority. That trying to be wiser than the laws is what's forbidden in praised laws. So much for laws. Regarding witnesses, witnesses are of two kinds, ancient and recent, and of the latter some share the risk, others are outside it. By ancient I mean the poets and other notable people whose judgments are known, as the Athenians used Homer as witness about Salamis, the Tenedians recently used Periander of Corinth against the Sigians, and Cleophon used Solon's elegies against Critias, saying his family was long dissolute, otherwise Solon wouldn't have written. Tell red-haired Critias to listen to his father. These witness about past events, about future ones, oracle givers too, as Themistocles did about the naval battle, saying, wood and wall. Further, proverbs are testimony, as if someone advises not to make an old man a friend, the proverb testifies. Never do good to an old man. And about killing sons whose fathers you kill. Foolish who kills the father and leaves the sons. Recent witnesses are notable people who have made some judgment. Their judgments are useful for those disputing the same matters. Eubulus used in court against chairs what Plato said to Archibius, that admitting to being wicked had increased in the city. Also those sharing the risk if they seem to be lying. But such witnesses only testify whether something happened or not, whether something is or isn't, not about quality, like whether just or unjust, advantageous or disadvantageous. Outside witnesses are more credible about these things, ancient witnesses most credible, they're incorruptible. Confirmation regarding testimony. One lacking witnesses should say judgments must be made from probabilities, and this is best judgment. That probabilities can't be bribed to deceive. That probabilities aren't convicted of false witness. One having witnesses against an opponent without them should say that probabilities aren't accountable in court, and there would be no need for testimony if it were sufficient to consider things just from arguments. Testimony is either about oneself or one's opponent, either about the matter or about character. So clearly one never lacks useful testimony. If not supporting our case or opposing our opponents, then about character, either our own worthiness or our opponent's unworthiness. Other points about witnesses, whether friend, enemy, or neutral, reputable, disreputable, or in between, and other such differences, should be argued from the same topics we use for enthymemes. Regarding contracts, argument is useful to the extent of making them credible or not credible, trustworthy or untrustworthy. If they support us, trustworthy and authoritative. If they support our opponent, the opposite. Making them credible or incredible is no different from the treatment of witnesses. Contracts are credible according to the character of their signatories and guarantors. If a contract is agreed to exist and supports us, we should amplify. The contract is a private and partial law. Contracts don't make law authoritative, but laws make legal contracts authoritative. Law itself is a sort of contract, so whoever distrusts or violates a contract violates the laws. Further, most transactions, involuntary ones, are conducted through contracts, so if these become invalid, people's mutual dealings are destroyed. The other appropriate points are easy to see. If contracts oppose us and support our opponents, first, whatever arguments one would use against an opposing law apply. It's absurd if we think we shouldn't obey laws that weren't correctly established by mistaken legislators, but must necessarily obey contracts. Then, that the juror is a judge of justice, so he should consider not this but what's more just. Justice can't be perverted by deceit or necessity, it's natural. But contracts can be made by the deceived and forced. Further, see if it conflicts with any written or common laws, and if with written, whether our own or foreign laws. Then if with other contracts, later or earlier, either the later are authoritative and the earlier invalid, or the earlier are right and the later deceptive, whichever is useful. Also consider advantage, if it somehow opposes the judge's interest, and other such things. These two are similarly easy to see. Evidence from torture is a kind of testimony and seems credible because some necessity is present. It's not difficult to say what's possible about this too, from which one can amplify if torture supports us, that this alone is true testimony. If it opposes us and supports our opponent, one could refute it by speaking truly about the whole class of torture evidence. People under compulsion tell lies no less than truth, both persisting in not telling the truth and readily lying to stop sooner. One should be able to refer to examples that the judges know. One should say that evidence from torture isn't true. Many thick-skinned, tough-souled people nobly endure compulsion, while cowardly and cautious ones lose courage before even seeing the instruments, so nothing in torture is credible. Regarding oaths, one can distinguish four ways. Either one gives and receives, or neither, or one but not the other, and of these, either gives but doesn't receive, or receives but doesn't give. Besides these, whether an oath has been sworn by oneself or one's opponent. If not giving an oath, because people easily perjure themselves, because the one who swears doesn't pay back, because one thinks judges will convict without an oath, and because the risk with judges is better, one trusts them but not the opponent. If not receiving an oath, because an oath is a substitute for money, because if one were base, one would have sworn, better to be base for something than nothing. By swearing one wins, by not swearing one doesn't. Thus not swearing would be from virtue, not fear of perjury. Xenophanes' saying applies, that this challenge isn't equal for the impious against the pious, but like a strong man challenging a weak one to strike or be struck. If receiving an oath, because one trusts oneself but not the opponent. Turning around Xenophanes' saying, one should say it's equal if the impious gives the oath and the pious swears. It's terrible not to be willing oneself regarding matters where one expects the judges to decide under oath. If giving an oath, because it's pious to be willing to entrust matters to the gods, because the opponent needs no other judges, one gives him the decision, because it's absurd for him not to be willing to swear about matters where he expects others to swear. Since how to speak in each case is clear, it's also clear how when they're combined, if one wants to receive but not give, if one gives but doesn't want to receive, if one wants to receive and give, or neither, these are necessarily composed from what's been said, so the arguments too are composed from what's been said. If an oath has been sworn by oneself and contradicts, it's not perjury. Doing injustice is voluntary, perjury is doing injustice, but what's done by force and deceit is involuntary. Here one should conclude that perjury is with the mind, not the mouth. If the oath opposes the opponent, one should say that everything is overturned if people don't abide by what they've sworn. That's why judges use laws under oath. They expect you to abide by your oath in judging, but they themselves don't abide by theirs. And whatever else one might say in amplifying. So much for non-technical proofs.